People in the area noticed him, but no one truly saw him. He was the man who walked the same road every morning, wearing the same faded jacket even when the weather changed. His shoes were always clean, but old, the kind that had been repaired more than once. He never rushed. He never complained, and he never explained himself. To most people, that meant only one thing: he was struggling. At the small office where he worked, he sat near the back. His desk was plain, with no photos, no decorations, nothing personal except a simple notebook and a pen. While others talked loudly about weekend plans, new phones, or family dinners at restaurants, he listened quietly. When the topic turned to money, people lowered their voices around him, as if afraid of making him uncomfortable. Some felt pity. Others felt awkward. A few felt superior. He brought the same lunch every day. Plain food packed neatly in a reused container. When coworkers ordered food together, they sometimes asked him if he wanted to join. He always smiled and said he was fine. After a while, they stopped asking. It was easier to assume he couldn't afford it. No one considered that he simply didn't want to. Whispers followed him, though never directly. People said he lived alone in a small rented place. Someone claimed he once saw him counting coins at a shop. Another said he never took vacations because he couldn't afford time off. None of them knew if these stories were true. They repeated them anyway. Over time, the stories became facts in their minds. He noticed the looks, of course. The quick glances at his clothes. The careful way people spoke to him. The way conversations changed when he joined them. He noticed, but he didn't react. Long ago, he had learned that correcting people only invited more questions. Silence was easier. Outside of work, his life followed a quiet routine. He woke early not because he had to, but because he liked the calm of the morning. The streets were peaceful then. No noise, no judgment. He enjoyed walking, watching the city slowly come alive. He often stopped at the same small tea stall, where the owner greeted him without asking questions. He paid in cash, always exact change. That detail alone fed the rumors. In the evenings, he returned home before dark. His building was old, with chipped paint and stairs that creaked underfoot. Neighbors passed him without much interest. Some nodded politely. Others barely noticed him at all. To them, he was just another quiet tenant with nothing special about him. Inside his apartment, things were simple but clean. Nothing fancy. No expensive furniture. Just what he needed. A small table, a chair, a bed, and a shelf filled with neatly arranged papers and old notebooks. He treated those notebooks with care, as if they held something important. They did, but no one else knew that. There were moments when the weight of other people's opinions pressed on him. Like the day a coworker joked loudly about how hard it must be to survive on such a small salary. Laughter followed. The joke wasn't aimed directly at him, but everyone knew who it was about. He smiled faintly and kept working. Inside, something tightened, but he didn't let it show. Another time, someone offered him spare change after he helped carry heavy boxes. The offer came with good intentions, but it still stung. He thanked them politely and refused. That refusal only strengthened their belief that he was proud but poor. What no one understood was that his quiet nature had nothing to do with money. It came from experience. From lessons learned the hard way. Years ago, his life had been loud, busy, and full of people who were interested in what he had, not who he was. When things changed back then, he promised himself he would never let money define his relationships again, so he chose to live small, to blend in. To keep his life private, it was a choice, not a failure. But choices are often misunderstood when people don't know the reasons behind them at work. A new project brought extra stress. Deadlines were tight, and mistakes were not forgiven easily. One afternoon, an error appeared in a report. It wasn't his mistake, but the blame drifted toward him naturally. Someone even said, half joking, that maybe he was distracted by personal money problems. The words were light, but the message was heavy. He didn't defend himself. He never did. Instead, he fixed the problem quietly and stayed late to make sure everything was correct. When he finally left the office that night, the building was nearly empty. The city lights reflected in the windows as he walked out alone. On the way home, he stopped at a small grocery store. He carefully chose items, checking prices, comparing brands. To anyone watching, it looked like someone struggling to save every bit he could. The cashier barely looked at him as he paid. No one ever did. As he walked back, his thoughts wandered. He remembered a time when people used to watch him differently, with interest, with respect, sometimes with envy. That life felt distant now, almost unreal. He didn't miss it. What he missed was being treated fairly, without assumptions. Still, he reminded himself why he lived the way he did. Peace mattered more than appearances. Privacy mattered more than approval. He had learned that people often changed when they believed you had money. Kindness turned into expectation. Friendship turned into requests. Silence was safer. The next day brought an unexpected moment. A minor issue at work required everyone to confirm personal details for a routine update. When the topic of bank information came up, a few coworkers exchanged knowing looks. Someone whispered that it must be stressful for him. Another nodded in agreement. He heard them. He always did. His face stayed calm, but his thoughts moved quickly. He knew situations like this had a way of growing, of turning small misunderstandings into public moments. He wondered briefly if this would be one of those times. That evening, he sat alone in his apartment, reviewing old papers from his shelf. Documents that told a story no one else knew. A story of discipline, loss, patience, and long-term thinking. He closed the folder and placed it back carefully, as if closing a chapter. Outside, the city continued without him. People laughed, argued, hurried, and judged. Somewhere along the way, they had decided who he was without ever asking. And tomorrow, they would continue believing it. He lay down to sleep, unaware that the quiet life he had protected for so long was about to face a moment of exposure. A simple action, something ordinary, would soon force the truth into the open. Not because he wanted it to, but because life sometimes chooses the moment for you. For now, he remained what everyone believed him to be. A quiet man with little money and even fewer words. And no one suspected that their certainty was built on nothing at all. The next few days felt heavier than usual. Nothing had changed on the surface, yet the air around him seemed different. The looks at work lasted a second longer. Conversations paused when he walked by. It was not open cruelty, just quiet judgment. The kind that settles into a place and refuses to leave. The project deadline was close, and stress made people careless with their words. One afternoon, a small argument broke out over missing figures in a report. Voices rose. Someone slammed a file on the desk. In the middle of it all, a comment slipped out, sharp and unnecessary, about how mistakes happen when people are worried about personal finances. Laughter followed, thin and uncomfortable. He felt it land on him, even though no one said his name. He kept his eyes on the screen and continued typing. His hands were steady. His face showed nothing. Inside, however, old memories stirred. He had heard these tones before in another life, long ago. During a short break, he stepped outside the building. The sky was gray, the air cool. He stood near the entrance, watching cars pass. For a moment, he wondered what would happen if he spoke up just once. If he corrected them, if he ended the story they had created about him. The thought passed quickly. He knew better than to open doors that could not be closed again. Back inside, work continued. A coworker stopped by his desk and asked, in a careful voice, if everything was okay with him. The concern sounded real, but it was mixed with curiosity. He smiled and said he was fine. The coworker nodded, clearly not convinced, and walked away. At lunch, he sat alone as usual. Nearby, a group talked about rising costs and how hard it was to manage expenses these days. One person mentioned skipping payments. Another joked about checking bank balances with fear. Someone glanced toward him and lowered their voice. That small act said everything. He finished eating and threw away his container. As he washed his hands, he caught his reflection in the mirror. He looked tired but calm. He reminded himself that this was still better than before. Better than being surrounded by people who smiled only when they needed something. That evening, a message arrived from the building manager, reminding all tenants about upcoming rent verification. Documents would need to be confirmed at the bank. The notice was routine, but it tightened something in his chest. He knew paperwork had a way of becoming public, even when it shouldn't. The following morning, he stood in line at the local bank. It was crowded. People sighed and checked their phones. He waited patiently, holding a folder under his arm. A few familiar faces from the neighborhood were there too. Someone recognized him and nodded politely. When it was his turn, the teller asked simple questions. He answered quietly. The process took longer than expected, and a line formed behind him. Someone sighed loudly. Another muttered about time being wasted. He apologized softly, even though the delay was not his fault. As he stepped aside, he overheard a whisper. A comment about how banks make things harder for people with small balances. He pretended not to hear. He always did. Later that day, back at work, the topic of the bank visit somehow came up. News traveled fast in small circles. A few people asked casual questions, pretending they were just making conversation. He gave short answers and returned to his tasks. Pressure built slowly, like water rising behind a wall. A team meeting was scheduled to review personal details for the project's final stage. It required confirmation of information tied to payroll and records. The room was full. Everyone sat close together. As papers were passed around, someone joked about hoping their numbers still looked decent. Laughter followed. Another person said they didn't even want to know their balance. The attention drifted toward him again, quiet but focused. He felt the moment approaching, though nothing had happened yet. His heart rate remained steady. He had faced harder moments than this. Still, he sensed that this situation was moving toward something unavoidable. That night, he did not sleep easily. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to distant traffic. Thoughts moved through his mind slowly. He remembered the early years, when he worked long hours and lived even more simply than he did now. He remembered saying no to comfort, no to shortcuts, no to quick rewards. There had been a time when he trusted people too easily, when he shared too much, when his success became public knowledge. That was when relationships changed. Conversations became about favors. Smiles became measured. Silence followed when he said no. When things later fell apart, many disappeared without a word. That lesson stayed with him. From then on, he chose to keep his life quiet. Morning came too soon. He dressed carefully, as he always did, choosing the same simple clothes. At work, the meeting began. Names were called one by one. Each person confirmed details and moved on. When it was his turn, the room felt smaller. The manager asked him to confirm his bank information later that day, just to complete the process. The request was normal, but the attention it drew was not. A few people exchanged looks. Someone raised an eyebrow. Someone else smirked. He nodded and agreed. No argument. No reaction. The meeting moved on, but the feeling did not. After work, he walked slowly toward the bank again. The sun was low, casting long shadows. He thought about turning back, about finding another way. But he knew delays would only make things worse. Inside the bank, it was quieter than before. A few customers waited. He took a seat and rested the folder on his lap. His fingers traced the edge of the papers inside, worn from years of handling as he waited. He noticed a familiar coworker enter and sit a few seats away. Their eyes met briefly. The coworker looked away, pretending to scroll through their phone. The silence between them felt loud. When his number was called, he stood and walked to the counter. His steps were steady. The teller greeted him and asked how they could help. He took a breath and spoke calmly. He asked for confirmation. Simple words. Ordinary request. The teller typed something into the system. Her expression changed slightly, just enough for him to notice. She looked at the screen again, then at him, then back at the screen. Her fingers paused. Behind him, the waiting area was quiet. He could feel eyes on his back. Not because they knew anything yet, but because moments like this always draw attention. The teller asked him to wait a moment and called someone quietly. He nodded and stepped aside. His heart beat a little faster now, not from fear, but from knowing that the wall he had built so carefully was starting to crack as he waited. He thought about how strange life was, how years of effort could be undone by a single ordinary moment. A balance check. A routine task. Nothing dramatic, and yet it felt like standing at the edge of something big. The teller returned, her voice polite but different now. She asked him to confirm his identity again. He did. Her eyes widened just slightly before she caught herself. From the corner of his eye, saw the coworker watching openly now, phone forgotten. Others nearby seemed curious too. The quiet had changed. It was no longer bored silence. It was expectation. He remained calm. His face showed nothing. But inside, he knew that once the words were spoken, once the numbers were seen, things would never return to the way they were. He wondered if people would feel ashamed, or if they would simply feel surprised. Experience told him it would be the second. The teller turned the screen slightly, preparing to speak. He took a slow breath and waited. Whatever happened next would no longer be his choice. The teller cleared her throat softly. She looked at the screen again, as if making sure it was real. Then she looked back at him. Her voice stayed polite, but there was something new in it now. Careful tone she hadn't used before. She asked him to confirm his request once more. He nodded and said yes, that he only needed a simple confirmation. Nothing else. She typed again. The keys made quiet sounds in the still space. Every second felt longer than it should have. People behind him shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Someone else leaned forward, trying not to look obvious. He stood with his hands folded in front of him. His shoulders were relaxed. Inside, he felt calm in a strange way. This was the moment he had avoided for years, and now that it was here, there was nothing left to fear. The teller's eyes widened, just for a second. Then she straightened her posture. She turned the screen slightly away from public view, but it was too late. A reflection of numbers had already flashed. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She swallowed and spoke carefully. She told him his balance. The number was spoken clearly, without emotion. But the effect was immediate. Silence fell like a weight. Someone behind him let out a quiet sound of surprise before catching themselves. Another person whispered, thinking they were being subtle. The coworker sitting nearby stared openly now, eyes fixed on the counter. The teller apologized, perhaps for the pause, perhaps for the attention. She asked if he needed a printed statement. He shook his head gently and said, "No, thank you." His voice was steady, but the room had changed. The air felt different, charged. People who had been bored moments ago were now alert, curious, confused. The coworker stood up slowly, walking closer, pretending to be in line for another service. Their eyes moved from the teller's face to his, searching for confirmation. He didn't offer any. He signed where asked and stepped aside. The teller wished him a good day, her respect now clear in the way she spoke. He nodded and thanked her. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of stares. Not pity anymore. Not quiet judgment. This was something else. Shock, mixed with embarrassment. Some people looked away quickly. Others kept staring, unable to stop themselves. Outside the bank, the late afternoon light felt warmer than before. He paused for a moment on the steps, breathing in slowly. A simple errand had become something much bigger. He walked down the street, unaware that the moment was already spreading. A phone message sent. A quick comment made. A story beginning to change shape. By the time he reached home, messages were waiting. Not many, but enough to feel strange. Short notes asking if he was okay. Asking if everything was true. He did not reply. The next morning at work, the atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. People looked at him differently now, as if trying to see a new version of the same person. Someone who had barely spoken to him before greeted him warmly. Another asked if he needed help with anything. A third joked nervously, trying to sound casual, but the effort showed. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook like always. He focused on his work. He did not enjoy the attention. It felt just as uncomfortable as the pit he had. During a break, the coworker from the bank approached him. Their voice was low. They asked if they had seen correctly. If the number was real? The question wasn't rude, just honest curiosity. He smiled faintly and said that numbers were numbers. Nothing more. The coworker laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond, and walked away. At lunch, people invited him to join them. More than once. He declined politely, the same way he always had. This time, the looks exchanged were different. Confused, slightly offended, word continued to spread, though no one said it out loud. The quiet man wasn't who they thought he was. That simple idea unsettled people more than they expected. In the afternoon, a small mistake happened in the office. Normally, someone would have blamed him without thinking. This time they didn't. The silence spoke louder than words. As the day went on, he felt tired. Not from work, but from being seen. He had spent years becoming invisible on purpose. Now that invisibility was gone, on his way home, he noticed small changes. The shop owner greeted him with extra enthusiasm. A neighbor smiled and stopped to talk. These were kind gestures, but they carried a new tone. Interest. He nodded politely and kept moving. He didn't want to explain himself to anyone. He didn't owe them his story. That evening, he sat alone in his apartment. He opened one of the old notebooks from the shelf. Inside were notes written years ago. Plans, reminders, promises to himself. He read a line he had, written long ago, about staying quiet, about letting actions matter more than opinions. He closed the notebook slowly. For years he had believed that keeping his life small would protect him. In many ways, it had. But protection came with a cost. Misunderstanding, loneliness, judgment. Now the balance had shifted. People knew something they weren't meant to know. The question was what they would do with it. He lay down that night with mixed feelings. Relief that the truth was no longer hidden. Regret that it had been revealed at all. Tomorrow would be different. He could already feel it. And once people change the way they see you, they'd never fully change it back. After the balance check, life no longer moved quietly around him. It moved toward him. Slowly at first, then all at once. He felt it in small moments, like the way people paused before speaking, or how their voices softened when they addressed him. Nothing dramatic was said, but everything felt different. At work, his presence carried a new weight. Meetings that once ignored him now included his opinion. People asked what he thought, then actually listened to the answer. He responded politely, briefly, and without confidence or pride. He didn't want control. He only wanted space to do his job in peace. A few coworkers tried to act as if nothing had changed. They joked the same way, spoke the same way, but their eyes betrayed them. Others changed completely. Compliments appeared out of nowhere. Small favors were offered. Invitations were repeated even after he declined. One afternoon, someone stayed behind after everyone else left. The office was quiet, the lights dim. The person spoke carefully, saying they hadn't meant to judge him before. They said they hoped there were no hard feelings. He listened without interrupting. When the person finished, he nodded and said that people often see what they expect to see. Nothing more. The answer seemed to confuse them. They had expected forgiveness or anger. They received neither. That night, he walked home slower than usual. The streets were busy, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Memories surfaced, uninvited. Years ago, he had lived very differently. His days were loud and full. He worked long hours, took risks, and believed effort alone would protect him. When success came, it came quickly. Too quickly. People noticed. Friends multiplied. Advice was requested. Help was expected. At first, he enjoyed being useful. He believed generosity would strengthen relationships. But slowly, the balance shifted. Conversations became requests. Gratitude became entitlement. When he hesitated, smiles faded. Then came the mistake. One decision made with trust instead of caution. One promise broken by someone he believed in. The loss was heavy, not just in money, but in faith. People who once praised him disappeared. Some avoided him. Others blamed him. He rebuilt quietly after that. Not just his finances, but his boundaries. He learned to say no without explaining. He learned that privacy was not weakness. It was protection. He chose a simple life on purpose. Not because he lacked options, but because he valued control over comfort. He tracked everything, saved patiently, invested carefully. He lived below his means, far below what he could afford. It wasn't punishment. It was freedom. No one at work knew this. No one in the building knew. He never shared the story because he didn't want sympathy or praise. He wanted normal days and quiet nights. But now the quiet was gone. A few days later, a coworker approached him with a business idea. It was casual, framed as a friendly suggestion. He listened, then declined. The smile that followed was polite. Disappointment flickered behind it. Another person hinted at needing help with a personal problem. He offered advice. Nothing more. The conversation ended quickly. He saw the pattern forming again, just like before. Different faces. Same behavior. At home, he opened the old folder once more. Inside were records of years of discipline. Pages filled with notes, numbers, small reminders written during hard times. He touched them gently, remembering nights spent choosing patience over pleasure. He did not regret the choices. He regretted only that people rarely changed in the building. Neighbors were suddenly friendlier. One asked about his work. Another invited him for tea. He accepted once, politely, and kept the conversation light. When questions edged toward personal matters, he redirected them. He could feel curiosity growing around him like a quiet storm. People wanted answers. They wanted the story. He refused to become entertainment. At work, a decision had to be made on a project that affected many people. Previously, he would have been ignored. This time, his opinion tipped the scale. When the decision succeeded, credit followed. He accepted it calmly and moved on. Later, someone asked how he always seemed so steady, how stress never seemed to touch him. He paused before answering. Then he said that panic comes from depending on things you can lose overnight. Control comes from patience. The words surprised even him. That night, he realized something important. The secret had not been the money. It had been the discipline, the restraint, the ability to live without proving anything to anyone. The attention slowly became tiring. Being misjudged had hurt, but being rejudged was exhausting. He longed for the days when no one looked twice at him. One evening, he overheard two coworkers talking. One said they never would have guessed. The other said they should have known because quiet people always hide something. The words stayed with him. He didn't want to be a mystery. He wanted to be left alone. At home, he sat by the window and watched the city lights. He thought about how easily people connected worth with numbers. How quickly respect followed proof. He wondered what would happen next. Whether the attention would fade or grow. Whether he would have to make another choice. He already knew the answer. Change was coming again. Not because he wanted it, but because once a truth is seen, it cannot be unseen, and he would have to decide how much of himself. He was willing to protect this time. The change did not happen overnight. It arrived slowly in the way people adjusted their tone when speaking to him, or how they waited for his reaction before finishing a sentence. Respect had replaced doubt, but it felt heavier than the doubt ever did. At work, people now sought his approval. They asked for his opinion even on small matters. When he spoke, the room listened. When he stayed quiet, the silence felt uncomfortable. He noticed how quickly people leaned toward him now. How easily his presence filled space it never had before. He did not enjoy it. One morning, the meeting ran longer than expected. Voices overlapped, ideas clashed, and tension rose. At a certain point, someone turned to him and asked what they should do. The question carried trust, but also expectation. He gave a calm answer, short and clear. The discussion ended almost immediately. As people left the room, he remained seated for a moment, staring at the table. He thought about how strange it was that nothing about him had changed, yet everything around him had. Later that day, a coworker stopped by his desk. They spoke openly, saying they felt embarrassed about how they had judged him before. They admitted they had assumed too much based on appearances. Their voice shook slightly as they spoke. He listened patiently. When they finished, he thanked them for being honest. He said he understood, because everyone judges with limited information. The coworker seemed relieved, as if expecting anger and finding none. Word spread that he was not bitter, that he was calm, that he did not hold grudges. This only increased people's interest in him. Outside of work, life changed as well. Neighbors who once passed without notice now stopped to talk. Invitations appeared more often. Some were genuine. Others were careful, measured as if trying to stay on his good side. He accepted fewer invitations than before. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. He had learned that attention often came with hidden expectations. One evening, while walking home, he passed the small tea stall he had visited for years. The owner greeted him warmly, offering an extra cup without charge. He smiled and paid anyway, the same way he always had. The owner looked surprised and nodded with respect. That small moment mattered more to him than any compliment at work. Over time, the excitement around his balance faded, but the shift in behavior did not fully disappear. People still remembered. They still adjusted. He realized that once a label changes, it never truly goes back to neutral. At work, a promotion opportunity came up. Several people encouraged him to apply. They said he deserved it. They said his experience and calm nature made him the right choice. He considered it carefully. Not the title, but the change it would bring. More visibility. More attention. More assumptions. In the end, he declined. The decision confused many. Some thought he was being modest. Others thought he was hiding something. A few respected the choice immediately. When asked why, he simply said he valued balance in his life. Nothing more. That answer followed him for days. Balance. People repeated it. Trying to understand at home, he sat alone with his notebook spread out on the table. He reviewed old goals, many already completed. Others no longer mattered. He realized that the life he had built quietly was exactly the one he wanted. The world had tried to pull him into a different story. He refused. One afternoon, a new coworker joined the team. Young, unsure, and clearly nervous. Others spoke loudly around them, confident and relaxed. He noticed the way the new person sat quietly, just trying not to draw attention. During a break, he walked over and spoke to them gently. Asked how they were settling in. Offered help without making it obvious. The relief on the person's face was clear. Watching that, he understood something important. Power did not come from money or recognition. It came from knowing who you were when no one was watching. As weeks passed, the noise around him softened. People grew used to the idea that he would not change, that he would not spend more, speak louder, or live bigger just because he could. Some lost interest. Others stayed respectful. A few became genuine friends. That was enough. One evening, as he prepared for bed, he thought back to the moment at the bank. How a simple request had turned his life upside down. How close he had come to losing the quiet he worked so hard to protect. He did not regret the truth coming out, but he was glad it did not change him. In the end, people learned something, though not everyone understood it fully. They learned that appearances lie, that silence does not mean weakness. That worth cannot be measured by what is visible. He learned something too, that no matter how carefully you live, the world will still try to define you. The only real choice is whether you accept that definition or walk away from it. On his last walk of the day, the city lights reflected softly on the road. He moved at the same pace he always had, calm, unhurried. To some, he would always be the man they once thought was broke. To others, he would be the man who surprised them. To himself, he was simply someone who had chosen peace over proof. And that, more than any balance, was the secret that truly mattered. Time passed, and the world around him settled into a new rhythm. The sharp curiosity faded first. Then the quiet expectations softened. What remained was a gentler awareness, the kind that no longer stared, but still remembered. At work, people no longer watched his every move. They had learned that he would not change for their approval. Meetings returned to normal length. Conversations flowed again without pauses when he entered the room. In some ways, things felt almost like before, only calmer. He noticed that a few people treated him exactly the same as they always had. Those were the ones who had never judged him loudly or quietly. He valued them more than they knew. One afternoon, the manager asked him to help mentor a small group. The request was respectful, not forceful. He agreed, but only on one condition. He wanted the focus to be on skills, not status. The manager accepted without question. During the sessions, he spoke plainly. He shared lessons without stories about money or success. He talked about patience, consistency, and making choices that matched one's values. The room listened, not because of what they believed he had, but because of how he spoke. After one session, someone stayed behind and asked how he stayed so grounded. The question was honest, without curiosity attached to numbers or lifestyle. He answered slowly, choosing his words. He said that when you stop trying to prove yourself, life becomes quieter. And in that quiet, you can finally hear what matters. The words stayed with the person. He could tell. Outside of work, he continued his routines. Morning walks, evening tea, simple meals. Nothing changed there. He found comfort in repetition. It reminded him that peace was built, not discovered. Sometimes, he thought about how easily his life could have gone in another direction. If he had chased attention, if he had explained himself, if he had tried to correct every wrong assumption, but he had learned that explanations often feed curiosity. It's not understanding. One weekend, he cleaned his apartment thoroughly. He sorted through old papers and notebooks again. This time, he let go of a few things he no longer needed. Not because they were painful, but because they belonged to a chapter already closed. He kept the first notebook, though. The one that reminded him where discipline began. In the building, neighbors returned to their usual distance. Friendly, but not overly interested. He preferred it that way. A quiet hello in the hallway felt more honest than forced conversation. One evening, as he returned home, he noticed someone struggling with groceries at the stairs. Without thinking, he helped. No one commented. No one stared. The moment passed like any other. That simplicity felt like a gift. At work, a mistake happened again, much like before. This time, someone else was blamed unfairly. He noticed it immediately. Instead of staying quiet, he spoke up calmly and corrected the misunderstanding. The room went silent, then moved on. Later, the person thanked him quietly. He nodded and said nothing more. He did not want gratitude. He wanted fairness. That was when he understood something clearly. His role was never to be invisible. It was to be steady. Weeks later, he stood once again in the same bank for a routine update. This time, no one recognized him. No whispers followed. The teller processed his request normally. No pauses. No widened eyes. As he left, he felt a sense of closure. The moment that had once shaken his quiet life had faded into memory. What remained was the lesson. People will always guess. They will build stories from fragments. Some will judge kindly. Others will not. That was beyond his control. What he could control was how much of himself he gave away. On a calm night, he sat by the window again, watching the city lights. He felt content, not because of what he had, but because of what he no longer needed. He did not need approval. He did not need to explain. He did not need to be seen. He only needed to live in a way that felt true to him. And so he did. Quietly, steadily, on his own terms. Life did not slow down after everything settled. It simply became quieter in a different way. The noise was no longer outside him. It was inside others, as they slowly adjusted their understanding of who he was and who they had been at work. New people joined, and old ones left. The office changed as places always do. He remained, Not because he feared change, but because he was no longer chasing it. He had found a rhythm that suited him. The younger staff often watched him without realizing it. They noticed how he arrived on time and left on time, how he did not rush to speak, yet his words carried weight when he did. They noticed how he never complained, but also never allowed himself to be used. One afternoon, a disagreement grew louder than it should have. Two coworkers argued over responsibility for a mistake. Voices rose. Blame circled the room. Others stayed quiet, hoping not to be noticed. He watched for a moment, then spoke calmly. He did not take sides. He simply explained what had happened and how it could be fixed. The argument ended almost immediately. Not because he was right, but because his tone made it hard to continue fighting afterward. One of them asked him how he stayed so calm in tense moments. He thought for a second and said that panic only feels useful until it creates damage. Calm, he said, leaves room for solutions. That answer stayed with the person longer than they expected. Outside of work, his days were simple. He still walked the same streets, still visited the same shops, still lived in the same modest apartment. Nothing about his lifestyle changed, even though some people expected it to. A neighbor once asked him why he never moved to a bigger place. The question was casual, but loaded. He smiled and said that bigger spaces often collect more noise. The neighbor laughed, unsure whether it was a joke or a lesson. Some evenings, he sat alone with his thoughts and wondered how many people lived lives shaped by expectations that were never theirs. He had seen it before. People worked harder to look successful than to feel at peace. He had done that once, too. One weekend, he received a call from someone he had not heard from in years. The voice was familiar, careful, and slightly uncomfortable. They spoke about old times, about memories that felt distant now. Then the conversation shifted. There was an apology. It was not dramatic. No tears, just a simple admission that they had judged him wrongly back then, that they had walked away when things became difficult. He listened quietly. When the person finished, he thanked them for calling. He said forgiveness did not require reopening old doors. Some things, he explained, were better left as lessons, not invitations. The call ended politely. He sat in silence afterward, feeling neither relief nor anger, only clarity. Forgiveness, he realized, did not always mean reunion at work. His role slowly became less about tasks and more about guidance. People came to him with questions that had nothing to do with money or status. They asked about balance, about handling pressure, about knowing when to walk away. He never gave long speeches. He answered simply. He believed advice worked best when it sounded ordinary. One day a colleague stayed late, clearly overwhelmed. Papers were spread across the desk. Their shoulders were tense. He noticed and asked if they were okay. The question opened something. The person spoke about fear, about feeling behind in life, about comparing themselves to everyone else. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something small, almost quiet. He said that comparison steals time, and time is the one thing you never get back. The person nodded slowly, as if hearing the words for the first time. Moments like that reminded him why he stayed the way he was, why he refused to turn his life into a display. He wanted to be useful, not impressive. Outside, the city changed with the seasons. Hot days turned into cool nights. Streets emptied earlier. Lights softened. He enjoyed walking during those times, when the world felt slower. Sometimes, thought about how easily his story could be misunderstood if told by someone else, how people might focus on the money and miss everything else. He was glad he never told it himself. One evening, he returned home to find a note slipped under his door. It was from a neighbor, thanking him for helping during a difficult time months earlier. The note was simple. No praise. No questions. He placed it carefully on his shelf. That night, he dreamed of nothing at all. At work, a major change was announced. Departments would be restructured. Roles might shift. Some people panicked immediately. Others pretended not to care. He listened, asked a few practical questions, and returned to his desk. He knew uncertainty scared people more than loss. Over the next few weeks, rumors spread. Some said he would finally move into a higher position. Others said he would leave altogether. He did neither. When his manager asked about his plans, he answered honestly. He said he would stay as long as the work remained meaningful and the environment remained respectful. The manager accepted the answer without pushing. That conversation marked another quiet victory. Years ago, he would have felt pressure to justify himself. Now, he did not. One afternoon, as he walked home, he passed a man sitting alone on a bench staring at the ground. Something about the posture felt familiar. He slowed, then stopped. They spoke briefly. About the weather. About the day. Nothing important. As he walked away, he realized something simple and heavy at the same time. Everyone carried a story no one else could see. He had learned that lesson the hard way. Weeks turned into months. The excitement of the past faded into routine. New topics replaced old ones. People found new things to talk about. He remained steady. On a quiet evening, he sat by the window again, watching the city breathe. He thought about the moment people discovered the truth about him. How loud it had felt. How exposed now that moment seemed distant. He understood that life did not reward silence or noise. It responded to consistency. He did not know what the future held. He did not try to guess. He only knew that he would continue walking at his own pace, choosing peace even when the world tried to rush him, and that choice, repeated every day, was what truly made his life rich. Life continued in a way that felt steady but not dull. The days no longer surprised him the way they once did. It each carried small moments that reminded him why he had chosen this path. Quiet did not mean empty. It meant cleared at work. The team changed again. New systems, new rules, new faces. He adapted without resistance. Change had stopped feeling like a threat a long time ago. It was simply another movement of time. People still came to him for advice, but now it was different. They no longer asked because of what they believed he had. They asked because of how he listened. He never rushed anyone. He never interrupted. That alone made people feel seen. One morning, a coworker sat beside him before work started. The office was nearly empty. The person spoke about feeling lost, about chasing goals that no longer felt meaningful. The words came slowly, like they were being tested before being released. He listened and said that sometimes confusion is a sign that you have outgrown an old version of yourself. Not everything unclear is broken. Some things are simply changing. The coworker nodded quietly. That was enough. Outside of work, he noticed how the city felt different to him now. The noise did not pull at him the way it used to. He walked through crowds without feeling rushed. He stood in lines without irritation. Time felt slower when he stopped fighting it. He still visited the same tea stall. The owner no longer offered extra cups or special treatment. Things had returned to normal, and he liked that. Familiar routines grounded him. One evening, while walking home, he saw a small crowd gathered near the road. A minor accident had happened. Nothing serious, but people stood around, unsure what to do. He helped calmly, speaking clearly, making space. Within minutes, the tension eased. As he walked away, no one followed him. No one thanked him loudly. That felt right. At home, he spent more time reading old notebooks, not out of nostalgia, but reflection. He noticed patterns in his own life. Every time he chased approval, he lost peace. Every time he chose restraint, he gained clarity. He wondered how many people learned that lesson too late. One weekend, he took a longer walk than usual. He wandered into parts of the city he rarely visited. Older streets, quieter corners, places that felt forgotten. He enjoyed them. He sat on a bench and watched people pass. Couples talking, children running, someone arguing on the phone. Everyone was busy being someone. He felt grateful that he no longer needed to perform at work. A difficult decision had to be made that would affect several people. Emotions ran high. Opinions clashed. The room felt tense. When asked for his view, he spoke carefully. He said decisions should be made with respect, not fear. Fear makes people rush. Respect makes them listen. The decision was delayed by a day. The outcome improved. Later, someone told him that his words had changed the direction of the meeting. He nodded and returned to his desk. He did not feel proud. He felt useful. As weeks passed, the story of his life faded further into the background. New stories replaced it. New gossip. New assumptions. That cycle never stopped. He understood now that people always need a story. If it is not about you, it will be about someone else. One night, he received a message from someone he barely knew. They thanked him for something he did months ago, something he had forgotten. The message was simple, honest. He replied briefly and wished them well. That was enough. At home, his apartment remained modest. He replaced nothing that still worked. He fixed small things himself. He enjoyed knowing how little he needed to be content. Sometimes, he imagined what his life might look like to someone watching from the outside. Plain, uneventful, maybe even boring. He smiled at the thought. Boring, he had learned, was often another word for peaceful. One afternoon, he found himself standing again near the bank, though he did not go inside. He watched people come and go. Some looked stressed. Some looked confident. Most looked tired. He remembered the moment his own life had shifted there. How exposed he had felt. How heavy the attention was now. It felt distant. He walked away without looking back. At work, the younger staff began to trust him more openly. They asked about handling mistakes, about choosing between ambition and health. He never told them what to choose. He told them what questions to ask themselves. That approach worked. One evening, he stayed late to finish a task. The office was silent. He liked it that way. Silence helped him think. He realized something important in that quiet. His life no longer needed a next big moment. It did not need proof or validation. It was complete in its simplicity. He had spent years thinking peace was something to be earned. Now he knew it was something to be protected. Outside, the city lights flickered on. He gathered his things and left. As he walked home, his steps were unhurried. His thoughts were light. He felt no urge to rush into tomorrow. He had already arrived where he needed to be, and for the first time in a long while, that was more than enough.